Hello, friends and enemies, heroes and villains. Welcome to Epic Realms. Today's guest is a speculative fiction author and a poet whose latest book, The Glass Labyrinth, was released on June 27th. Please welcome Hailey Spencer to Epic Realms. How are you doing?
Day's going well. How
Good.
about yours?
It's going good. Going good. Tell us a little bit about a young Hailey Spencer. If writing was a passion for you early on in childhood, as a kid growing up, or was that something that developed later?
Writing has definitely always been a passion for me. One of the stories that my dad tells about me from when I was, I think, 4 or 5, is that I was talking to him and I told him that I wanted to tell stories, but specifically, I wanted to write stories about things that have happened before and will happen again, which he thought was kind of profound. So he asked me for an example, and I paused and said, like people eating grapes. So, yes, definitely always very interested, I think, in people and what makes people work and how people interact with each other. I found that a lot of my writing, especially in fiction, really focuses on complicated or fractured or just messy relationships between people who do still really care about each other. So, I think that definitely is something that has happened before and will happen again. But broadly speaking, I guess as a kid, it was storytelling. I'm sorry, I'm totally flustered and losing my thread. I'm gonna start over.
That's all right. That's all right. Let's
All
go.
right. Yeah. So I was really into storytelling, but I was also specifically really into storytelling as play. I would make up stories and ask the people in my life to act them out.
Okay.
So my mom always says that I was a very difficult child to play with because I would spend the whole time just giving her instructions. I would say, well, I will say this, and then you will say this, and then I will say this. And we would never actually get to playing the game because I was too interested in telling the story of what the game would be.
Right. Okay. Did you go to school and get like a lot of like you get to the writing classes or English and stuff and get super into that as opposed to some of the other curriculum?
My education journey was kind of interesting.
Okay.
So I went to in Seattle, we have what were at the time I went to them, they were called alternative schools. Now they're called creative approach schools.
Okay.
But specifically, it was schools that tended to have themed learning or learning that was really driven by the student. So in my third grade class, for example, our expedition is what we called it. Our expedition was children's rights and opera. And we did a big class project where we wrote a musical about children's rights. And I was on the writing crew for that. And so in school, because I had so many things like that where I could decide, what sorts of things I was going to work on, what I was most interested in, I definitely always went towards storytelling. But I didn't feel like I necessarily had to avoid other things because I usually could just make school whatever I wanted it to be in those areas.
Yeah. That's really cool. So did that have an effect on you later that process when you come across other people or other kids that were going to like a traditional type school?
That's an interesting question. I think when I was like really little, like elementary school, I didn't really think about it.
Okay.
As I got older, I definitely noticed it more. My high school was one that worked really well for me, but that a lot of people looked at kind of negatively because it was very student driven. And one of the things that meant was that some students made the choice to never go to class or to not really be focused on academics, and so it was not looked at as a very academically rigorous school.
Okay.
But for me, it really was because I had the option to study things outside of class that I was really passionate about. My first experience participating in National Novel Writing Month was at that school, and we actually had a class around it that was taught by a student. And so that student, under the guidance of a teacher, helped us plot our novels, figure out our strategies. I took that the first time my freshman year, and I wrote 50,000 words in a month. And I don't think it was great literature necessarily, but it taught me a lot about how I am as a writer and about the process of writing. And being able to get school credit for things like that was really incredible.
That's really awesome. How do because I'm unfamiliar with that. How do colleges? Because you did go to college, if I'm not mistaken.
I did,
What
yes.
was the process of going? Okay, this is my schooling, and then getting accepted into a college or choosing a college.
So there were different ways that people handled that. I think the letters of recommendation became especially important because our transcripts looked a little different.
Right.
But there were also, it was a school that knew that people were going to go to college. So there were ways they handled the transcripts. And so some of my classes, well, it might be an experimental philosophy class if it was technically through, if it was considered an English class within the school district, it would still be ninth grade English in that case.
Okay.
So, again, transcript can be a little complicated. I was a little
Yeah.
bit all across the board with what I was doing, but it also trying to figure out how to concisely explain it. Because we didn't have letter grades,
Right.
but we did have the expectation of 80% competency in every class, which in some ways is really nice because it means everyone who, if you finish a class, you got a B or higher. You had 80% competency. But for applying to colleges, they would actually hand calculate GPAs for us based on talking to our teachers and assessing where they thought we fell.
Okay. Cool. I see a lot of references to fairy tales wherever you're mentioned, and bios all over the place and people's references. What is your connection to fairy tales, and does that go back to your childhood as well?
So you've got me on pretty much my favorite topic to talk to anyone about.
Good,
So
that's my job.
definitely, what's that?
That's my job. That's my job.
Definitely large childhood love of fairy tales. I had these big, they were like the golden classics, those types of books, so the really big illustrated fairy tale books, and I would lay them out on my floor and I would lay down and flip through the pages and just read them for hours. And I was really interested in fantasy a lot as a kid too. But I think especially the way that fairy tales have a specific dreamlike quality and also often very specific rules, both of those things just scratched an itch for me. And then they've come into play in my writing for a long time, but where they ended up coming into play in my poetry was during my senior year of college. I was working on my honors thesis, which was supposed to be a poetry chapbook, and I was writing about something totally different, and I was getting really frustrated, and I'd kind of gotten myself into a corner because I had decided to write about some aspects of my life that I actually wasn't ready to write about.
Okay.
And I almost dropped out of the program. I went to my mentor and I was like, I don't have to do honors. This is too much. I'm done with this. And my mentor, Sharon Cumberland, lovely, lovely woman, she said, why don't we get lunch tomorrow and let's talk about it? And I got lunch with her the next day, and she said, "Forget what you were working on, forget what you've been doing all this quarter. What would you be interested in writing that would keep you in the program?" And I said, "I guess I've always been interested in fairy tales." And she said, "Okay, that's what you're gonna do." So she helped me find there was a research component, and this was week, I believe, 9 of the 10-week quarter. So I had to do quarters worth of research in 1 week to get into the component because everything I've been researching was for my previous topic.
Right.
She helped me find sources. She helped me get the research done. And then the next quarter, I wrote the chapbook that eventually evolved into Stories for When the Wolves Arrive.
Oh wow. Nice. What do you consider what do you consider is and isn't a fairy tale? Like, do you have a definition for what that is?
It's a good question. So when I was
And this
doing
is
the
to you,
research,
maybe not academically, to you.
yeah, I'm going to go a bit academic
Okay.
because
Yeah.
that's part of where my interests lie.
Okay.
So when I was doing the research component of this chapbook project, I discovered what's called the ATU, or Arm Thompson Uther folklore classification system. And they were involved in a really interesting project, which was ultimately not just to ask what is a fairy tale, but to ask what is each specific fairy tale. And so asking what is Cinderella, and then being able to break down the criteria of that story.
Right.
That's a project that was really interesting to me. And they have very rigid categories for what they consider fitting into the folklore index. And within the folklore index, there's a smaller subcategory that they consider fairy tales. And so that's one answer is just those numbers in that index, right?
Right.
But when I think for myself about fairy tales, and especially what I'm drawn to in fairy tales, I think the Jungian dreaminess is really important to me. The way that characters are in a time and place that we don't have to recognize as a real time and place, but that still clearly has some influences from the real world.
Right.
I like the magical realism and how there doesn't always have to be clear magic, but usually there's something a little bit supernatural, a little bit different. I really I know I used the word Jungian earlier, but I feel like there's a way that it's fairy tales at their best are tapped into a world slightly under the surface of our own. And I find that really exciting, and it's a world I really want to explore.
Nice. Do you have a favorite fairy tale or a favorite couple fairy tales?
I have some favorites. I have some favorite characters, especially, but in
Okay.
terms of tale type, usually the answer that I give for that is the East of the Sun, West of the Moon tale type.
Okay.
So I don't know if you're familiar with that one,
I'm not.
but it's in the same story family as Beauty and the Beast, but it's
All
much
right.
older.
Okay.
It's related to Cupid and Psyche as well. And so it's about a woman in East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which is a Scandinavian version. It's about a woman whose father marries her off to a polar bear. And when she goes to bed with the polar bear at night with the lights off, he comes to her in the form of a man. And she is so confused and frustrated by this. And she goes and visits home. And he tells her when she goes to visit home, you can go visit home, but don't listen to anything that your mother has to say about me. And her mother says, you've got to figure out what's going on at night. You have to light a candle and see who he is. And she does that. And the wax drips onto him, and he wakes up. And he's basically like, you messed everything up. The curse was going to be broken. Now it isn't. And he gets sent to the place east of the sun, west of the moon, and she has to go on a journey to rescue him. And so this comes up, it's a little bit different in different cultures. There's a Romanian version where she's married to a pig and she has to wear out 3 pairs of iron shoes and an iron staff in her journey to find him. But I love the adventure narrative to it.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting that a lot of the time, the idea people have about fairy tales is that women are always in complacent roles and that the only way to change that is we rewrite the stories. But this is one of the oldest fairy tales we have access to. And it's about a woman who messes up and goes on an adventure to right the wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really awesome. I was also going to ask you about favorite archetype, but you kind of got that in there, right?
I have some other favorite archetypes.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I really like the crone as an archetype. Baba Yaga is one of my all-time favorite folklore characters. So she is from Slavic folklore. She's an old lady witch, and she lives in a house that walks around the forest on chicken legs.
Yeah.
And what I especially like about her is that she will sometimes offer blessings to people under the right circumstances, and sometimes she will eat the people under other circumstances. And I love that you don't know what to expect from her, and I like that she's not straightforwardly good or evil, and at times even serves as the magical helper in a story.
Yeah. At what point do you differentiate uh, fairy tale and folklore and religious iconography from the era?
Mm. It's a good question. So folklore, I think the oral tradition is a really important part of that.
Hmm.
So when you think about something like East of the Sun, West of the Moon, that is a story that is very old and that was told orally between people. And so there's a tradition within that. And there's ways that stories change from being told, but there's also ways in which stories actually preserve themselves from being told, right? There's patterns to stories. One of the theories for why threes come up so much in fairy tales is it's an easy number to remember. And when you compare something like that to Beauty and the Beast, which is within the same tale family,
Right.
Beauty and the Beast is a literary fairy tale. It was written by one person. We know who it was. We know the social circumstances under which she wrote that. And we know historically what some of the elements that may have affected that story were. And I think both are really interesting. But I think what excites me so much about folklore is you take a tale like Cinderella, for example. Cinderella's been found cross culturally, and they worked really hard to see if they could trace how it traveled and how it got from place A to place B and where it was first. And that's one they've really struggled with. That seems to have cropped up independently in lots of places. And I find that really exciting.
Yeah. It's awesome. I love the history of things like folklore, fairy tales. I'm very with you on all that. I'm not as educated as you are, but I very much enjoy a lot of that. And of course, how they travel is really cool, and seeing which regions have which things and which ones mesh up and whatnot. It's always fascinating to me when you find things like that that match. They have the same stories, just little variations all over the place, and you go, how did they get that? How did they all get that same story? Did they hear that from somewhere? Was it word of mouth, or is it a universal story that everybody just can relate to. So I love all of that. Do you have other inspirations that you had growing up besides fairy tales, whether it's other novels, books, movies, games, music?
Mm. The first thing that's popping to my head is Studio Ghibli. I really loved Spirited Away, especially as a child. I think that in many ways that movie instilled the love of horror that I still have because it's such I mean, it is a horror narrative. It's a horror narrative for children, but
Right.
I remember watching it and being scared and delighted at the same time. And I think that was the first time I'd experienced that emotion and realized how delightful feeling scared in the right way can be when hearing a story. And of course, Miyazaki, I mean, the art is so beautiful. There are strong folklore influences. The other one of his that I really remember was Princess Mononoke,
Yeah.
which I would consider an eco horror film. I was about 9 or 10 years old and I saw it at my grandmother's house. I think that I was slightly young for it, and I think my grandmother didn't quite know all of the story beats.
Right.
But again, I just watched it and I was scared, but also thought it was interesting, and I loved the story, and the characters were so complete and also really complicated in a way I liked. Like, they're in some ways are heroes and villains, and in some ways there really aren't, and things are just happening.
Yeah. I think those films shifted anime culture, just period. Like that's a landmark moment uh, in anime culture are those films, because you have movies that people reference before then, and those are all like the iconic ones, and then there's like this lull of like, yeah, they had stuff, but it was just stuff, and then you have those, and it's like, oh, that's a landmark moment. Like people reference that moment in time and those stories and those films a lot, and I think
Mhm.
it's a really cool thing to see happen uh, in the evolution of anime and storytelling, just storytelling in general, right?
Yeah. I think Miyazaki took I mean, I think you're right. I think he took that medium places that people hadn't realized it could go
Right.
in a way that was very exciting.
That's really cool. Where do you see that as far as an inspiration, and just the storytelling portion, or the characters, or in what ways do you feel that that has inspired you in just in general?
I think that the characters are a really big part of it. And then I think also place as character would be the other part of it. So I'll kind of break those down separately.
Okay.
But for characters, one thing that I just think is absolutely astounding about Miyazaki's storytelling is you look at a movie like Totoro, and I don't know if there is a movie that better captures what it is like to be a child from a child's point of view. I think that you are so in the story with the characters in a way that a lot of the time child characters feel written from an adult lens. But in Totoro and within the magical realism how that story is told, I remember being a kid, and thinking there was a forest in my backyard because there were 10 or so trees and I was small enough that I couldn't see all the way through them all the time.
Right.
And I remember thinking there were strange creatures in my yard. And I also remember, really caring about my little sister and being worried a day when she ran away from home for a little while. And so there's so many things in that kind of story that resonate. And I think that's true throughout Miyazaki's work. Like I said, with Princess Mononoke and how there aren't quite heroes or villains, every character really stands in who they are and has a reason for doing the things they do. And it also creates really complicated relationships in a way that I find satisfying, and like I said earlier, in terms of my own writing, I think one of the most interesting things to write is complicated relationships and characters who feel like they could walk off the page in their complexities.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then in terms of Place's character, I mean, Princess Mononoke, again, is a really good example of that, but where sometimes stories just feel like they're set somewhere just because. And Miyazaki's work never feels that way. Wherever he puts it, it feels like this is the only place the story could have been, and this place informs the actions of the people who are in it.
Yeah.
I think about that when I'm writing a scene in fiction and I'm really struggling, I sometimes change the setting, and I sometimes ask myself, "Why are the characters here? Why aren't they in this other place?" And usually changing the setting does unstick something, because there is so much that's always happening around us in our world that changes how we behave in a way that we're not conscious of. But I do think as a reader, if the characters aren't in the right place for what's happening, you know. And that's not just plot wise, but also like, are they in the right place for this conversation?
Yeah. That's a really cool insight. I really dig that. When you were going to college, as we mentioned earlier, uh, it, as we've talked, it sounds like writing was kind of just from the very beginning. When you were selecting, like, hey, this is where I'm going to go to school, this is what I'm going to go to school for, was poetry the plan? Was speculative fiction the plan? Was something else the plan originally going in? And did that shift?
Fiction was the plan. Poetry surprised me. So my first year of college, I was at a school that did freshman cohorts. I can't remember what they were officially called, but they might have been called cohorts. Essentially, you were in a cohort around they were living learning communities because it was where we lived. So your dorm was based on a topic, and then based on which dorm you were in, there were things like outdoor adventures, so that group of students, they would go and do things and hiking on the weekends.
Okay.
I ended up in the poetry living learning community, which I don't think was even my first choice. I think I wanted to be an outdoor adventures. And I had never really thought of myself as a poet. I thought I'm a fiction writer. And when I would try to write poetry or dabble in it, I would be like, this is a private thing just for me. I'm never going to be good at this. Part of why I felt that way is that in Seattle, when I was in high school, the really big thing in the poetry scene among people my age was slam poetry. And so when I thought about poetry, that was what I thought about. And for whatever reason, that isn't something that has been as interesting to me or has worked as much for me. But when I was suddenly in this poetry cohort where we took a class together, and I started learning different poetic forms and being asked to write in certain ways and try out certain exercises, I really loved it. I loved that it's a non straightforward way to say things.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I realized was that when a poem wasn't working, it was usually because I needed to be weirder or more detached or more surreal or something like that. Because typically, if there's something you can say straightforwardly, a poem's not going to be your venue to do it. You want to write an essay or a short story or an email, I don't know, depending on what you're
Yeah,
doing.
yeah, yeah.
And so recognizing that poetry exists to express things that we can't express in regular words opened something up for me. And especially learning certain specific forms opened something up for me. And forms were not something I'd been introduced to when I was younger, very much in a slam poetry culture where which is a sort of form, but it's not a form like certain kinds of page poetry, like a sonnet or a pantoum or a villanelle. There aren't the same kinds of rules. And it did turn out I thrived under those rules, which was, again, something that really surprised me. And then later on throughout school, poetry kept cropping up. So for my honors project, I had applied in two categories. I'd applied in poetry and fiction. And I had been really wanting to do fiction, but I applied for poetry as a backup because my poetry teacher told me that if I applied for poetry, she would accept it. And that was the one I got. So once again, poetry was something I kind of ended up with as a second choice, but then realized it was something I really wanted to be doing.
That's really cool because a lot of people, you never know. You never know the path on how to get there. Did you have any struggles in your path to become published? Any other like stepping stones you had to get from college to get to your first publication?
Oh, definitely. So, Stories for When the Wolves Arrive, like I said, was my honors thesis in college. So that was spring of 2017. That book was published in fall of 2022. So that's about a 5-year
Yeah,
gap of time.
yeah,
Now, part of that was that my honors thesis was a chapbook, and I developed it into a full book before publication. But a lot of it was just process, and a lot of it was that book not yet being where it needed to be. So my first year after college, I revised that book. I thought I had it where it needed to be. I started submitting. I was also submitting individual poems because that's what my mentor had told me to do. And I was getting rejections, and I made a goal for myself because what I had done previously is I would get rejected and I would feel really sad. And I would wait like 6 months and then I would send out one more piece and then I would get rejected and I would get really sad. And I was like, that's not tenable. That's not going to get me anywhere if
right,
it's taking me this long. So initially, my goal was 10 rejection letters in the year. But then the more I started submitting, the more I was like, oh, I can do this in bulk, essentially. And so I upped my goal to 50 rejection letters. And I was very clear with myself that my goal was rejection letters because then I could still meet my goal, even if nobody wanted to publish me at all.
Yeah.
And that was the year my first poem got published. But it still took several years after that for stories when the wolves arrived to get published. It came close a few times. You know, I had presses who held on to it for a couple cycles and then were like, "We're sorry, this just isn't it." And then it was during COVID lockdown. I had been working as a substitute special education assistant, which meant, the schools were closed. They didn't need any substitutes. I was unemployed. I went back to this book and I read it again. And we also, in my house at the time, I had several roommates and we instituted mandatory reading time every day.
Okay.
We had a couple of mandatory times so that we wouldn't go crazy being shut in the house. So I finally was reading all these folklore texts I had bought and started to read and never read. And while I was doing it, I was rereading stories from When the Wolves Arrive, and I realized that I ended on the wrong spot and that I had been, I think, in a way that people often are when they experience fairy tales. Like, first, when we're kids, we really are like, okay, Disney and these stories, and they have happy endings and princesses and all of that. And then a lot of people get into the kind of edgy, grim phase where they're like, did you know the real origins of these stories? They're edgy, they're dark, they don't have happy endings, which, as I've learned more about the concept of originality and where the Grimm brothers fit in the canon, a lot of that's medium. I don't need to go into all of that. But what I realized was that my book had kind of done the same thing, where I had a beginning that was much lighter. It was really commonly known fairy tales, and I didn't go quite as deep into some of the trauma within these stories. And then in part two, I had gone all in on the trauma. I had picked the darkest stories that I was interested in, and I didn't really leave a lot of room for hope. And I realized I needed a third section to tie it together, and that I really needed to end with hope that feels real and go from this place of the hope that feels kind of fake and kind of like you're not getting anywhere through the place where you're actually dealing with the trauma and it's hard, back out to a place where there's hope that isn't bullshit and where it's hope that doesn't ignore what happened previously. And when I realized that's what I needed, that was when the book came together. And it was not too long after that point that a press decided that they wanted to publish it. So I do think, I mean, it wasn't ready yet, and I hadn't explored the things I needed to explore to get it there yet.
Yeah. I talking about poetry earlier, and you talked about like the emotions of it, and I by no means am, you know, in any way, shape, or form wanting to ever be published, but I do enjoy writing just for my own sake. And oftentimes poetry is often something that, like, when I'm really at the point where I'm like, I don't know what to do, doing something short and concise, I hearken back to my youth when that was very therapeutic to me. How therapeutic is it to you? There's a saying that I heard, I don't know, something about pouring an ocean into a thimble.
Mm.
And that's kind of what I feel like sometimes, where it's like, this is everything I've got into this little thing. And it's like, that's what poetry sometimes feels to me, that you're like, you pour all of this thing into a little short little thing, but there's so much there. And you've got so much into it, and it doesn't take a lot. And if you read it, you get a lot back. You know, if you dump that out, you still get the ocean back. What are your thoughts on the emotions and the therapeutic portion of writing poetry?
It's interesting for sure. When I was writing stories from When the Wolves Arrive, like I said, I've been trying before that to write a chapbook about some things that I had gone through that were really hard. And I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to use poetry as therapy. And it was too much and I was overwhelmed.
Okay.
And so I was like, I'm doing the opposite of that. I'm taking something I'm really interested in and just writing about that. And later, when I read it back, I was actually still using poetry as therapy, but I had given myself emotional distance. And actually, a lot of the themes that would have been in the book I had been trying to write made it into stories from When the Wolves Arrive. But because I wasn't trying to write, here's exactly what happened to me,
Right.
I wasn't as afraid of it. So I think there definitely is catharsis there. And I think that at times it's really easy to try to make it too much of a story. And I think poetry resists that. I can't remember which author this is, unfortunately, but there is an author who has talked about giving her students an assignment where they have to write down reflections from ordinary life
Okay.
without using metaphor. And she specifically has talked about how the line that I remember from her writing about the exercise was, "The glass of water sat on the brown table, and the light came in through three places." And she talked about how resisting metaphor and resisting interpretation are some of the hardest things to do,
Yeah.
but they're a lot of what gives meaning within poetry, especially. So I don't know if this is fully conclusive about anything, but those are some of the thoughts that I have about art and emotion, I guess, and especially poetry and emotion.
Yeah.
That I think that there is something about just trying to represent something exactly how it is and not try to explain it or analyze it that can be really powerful. And that, I mean, taking these fairy tales and trying to write, here is what I am saying about the characters, ended up being a similar exercise where I was really still talking about myself, but I was no longer doing that process of self-analysis that I
Yeah.
needed to get away from.
Your other book, Out of Love and Spring, how does that differ? How does that shift from the
So that
previous book?
one, it's interesting because I did technically write and publish Stories from the Wolves Right first. They came out very close together, which was a little chaotic for me.
Hmm.
And it was just the timing of the acceptances, and I didn't want to say no to either press. So Out of Love and Spring is a chapbook, and it's kind of in the middle of Stories from the Wolves Ride because I'd written the chapbook version of that. I'd written the version I thought I was going to publish, and I'd kind of set it aside. And these were poems that I wrote largely, I mean, I guess almost entirely in my early 20s. And I hadn't conceived of them as a book until I was just noticing chapbook submission opportunities. And I was like, well, I have a lot of poems. Which ones fit together? So I think in some ways, Out of Love and Spring is the book that is the most personally about my life. There are a lot of real things that have happened to me in that book. But it also, I don't know, it was interesting to have it published at a point where I had some emotional distance from the things that had happened
Okay.
that I was writing about. In some ways, it's not exactly the book that I would have written in the honors thesis, but I think there are some similarities in terms of just me being at a really transitional age where a lot of things are really weird and a lot of things are not how you're told they're going to be when you become an adult and things are confusing. And I guess similarly, it was like an attempt to make sense of things, but maybe not through the most direct routes. I don't know if that's a very clear answer. This book was a bit of a complicated one for me because it was not ever intended to be a book until suddenly it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Explain to our audience what a chapbook is so that they're aware. If we have a couple audience members that are like, what does that mean?
Yeah, so a chapbook, a lot of people in poetry end up publishing a chapbook before they publish their first full collection. It was kind of a fluke that mine came out simultaneously. But a chapbook is a collection of, you know, 20-ish pages of poetry, so it's not by any length means a full-length manuscript, but a lot of the time you create one to get your name out there and get your voice out there and kind of just show people what you can do in poetry.
Hmm.
And in this case, it was nice because I'm glad that these poems all made it into something tangible because I am really proud of a lot of this work I did in my early 20s. And it's also not especially similar to the things I write now. So I don't know where I would have put it otherwise.
Yeah. What let's talk about what you've been doing now. Let's talk about your latest book.
Oh, yes. So Glass Labyrinth, which just came out last Friday, very excited about it. And I feel like it definitely fits in with the conversation we're having right now.
Yeah.
So, Glass Labyrinth, I wrote in 2023 and then have done, of course, some revision since then over the course of getting published. But that book is really meaningful to me because I was in one of the roughest places of my life when I started writing that. And I didn't know I was writing a book when I started it. I knew that I was having a really hard time. And I think that was actually something that was writing as therapy that turned into writing as something more than just therapy, although it was
Right.
very therapeutic to write. So at the time I started it, it was the very beginning of 2023, and I had just quit a job that I had thought was going to be a long-term job. And I had quit due to burnout so severe that my therapist had told me that I was in real, like, physical health danger if I stayed at the job.
Yeah.
And so I was grieving. I was also in just a very weird place mentally and physically because of the toll that it had taken on my body. And I was, gosh, 28 years old, I think. So I had a lot of late 20s angst and also a feeling of I don't know what to do next. I quit my job without a plan, which I'm usually someone who has a plan. And so everything was open in front of me and I was scared. And it was also close enough to everything that had happened during COVID. And I hadn't processed most of that. I've been working in an elementary school and I just had to keep going. And so I never stopped and grieved or stopped and considered what was next for me. And so I was actually in the bathtub and started writing this strange dreamlike piece about somebody who is in a bath covered in decaying flowers and then giving three choices about what to do and whether to stay in the tub or get out of the tub. Um, and after you get out of the tub or stay in the tub, what happens next? So the third option for that first one is to burn the flowers in the yard. And I started just exploring all these paths in this kind of dreamscape where every path then had questions that led somewhere else. And I realized I was writing a choose your own adventure book,
Yeah.
which was something, I guess that's something that was inspiring to me as a kid. I loved those books, but I also didn't realize I was writing a book at first. I was just asking questions and trying to answer them. And eventually, the more I'm unraveling this, the more I realized that it was actually a meditation on grief. And at that time, so much happening in my life, I ended up also doing a lot of just processing of childhood things I'd never processed.
Hmm.
And so what this ended up turning into, after consulting with some of my close readers, I have friends who absolutely lovely people, happy to read things that I've written and tell me what they think. But I showed it to one of my close readers who loves choose your own adventure video games like visual novels.
Yeah.
And she was like, "This is really good. It's too all over the place. You need checkpoints like there are in a visual novel where, I'm thinking about Long Live the Queen, for example, very good visual novel. There's part where you're at a ball and there's part where you're at a party. And those are events that happen in the story and they might happen differently based on what came before them and what choices you've made. But those are story checkpoints and they create a frame that holds the story together.
Yeah.
And so through this book, I wove in 5 poems that were about my journey that year and some of the childhood things I was processing, and those poems are a lot more personal, but they create a frame to this strange dreamscape that the reader is wandering through. And I don't know, I feel very proud of this book and very excited about it. When I talk to people about it, they seem interested, like similarly interested in the choose your own adventure and the fact that it's about grief.
Yeah.
And it's made me realize that a lot of us have grief that we don't know how to process.
Yeah.
So part of my excitement about this book is just having some kind of tool or meditation for that grief.
Yeah. Do you hope that also helps other people to
Oh,
process their
absolutely.
own?
Yeah. And one of the things I was realizing as I realized it was a meditation on grief is that it has to be a choose your own adventure because grief is never the same way twice. And there might be familiar landmarks or things that we see diff the same thing differently going through at different times. And we might end up in the same place of healing after the grief, but it's never going to be the same twice. And so this book isn't the same way twice either.
That's amazing. I loved the concept when I read about it, and you had asked me, "Hey, do you want a copy to read?" And I saw it today, and I was like, "How did I miss this? I would have loved to." But in hindsight, I am like, I think I'd rather talk to you about it not knowing, because I think it makes it better to have that conversation between us, not really knowing exactly what it is, so that you can better explain it to me and the audience, right? How challenging was it then to look back and like, okay, well, these are the pages these things need to go on in order to get, from point A to point B, once you realized what you were doing, to then finish it?
It was difficult. There was a period of time where I had a spreadsheet. And then I realized the spreadsheet wasn't giving me what I needed. And so I used a tool, a mind mapping tool in Wavemaker where I could like write the name of the poem or the concept of the poem in a box and then connect it to everything it went to and from.
Okay.
And the revision process was difficult because besides just making sure it makes sense and making sure that you're not going in loops, there was also the fact that for every poem, I had to make sure it actually made sense with the things that led to it and the things it led to. And if I changed anything, I had to make sure that those changes didn't disrupt anything downstream.
Hmm.
I I'm sure that there are some places where there is still some strangeness that I didn't write out. I'm hoping that can just be part of the dreaminess of the storytelling, but I definitely think the process strengthened the poems, but it was a difficult process. It was definitely the most challenging revision process I've ever had because I had to focus on the book as a whole with every single piece I tinkered with.
How is that working? I'm assuming you had an editor of some sort. How is that working with an editor to go through that, or did you bypass that and just keep it in your close knit group?
So I had an editor through the press that I went through. But one thing I've learned through the small press process is that every small press does things a little differently. So, Stories from the Wolves Arrive came out through First Matter Press, which actually does a cohort model. So, every author within that year's publishing group helps revise each other's books. So, you get a lot of eyes on your books.
Okay.
Glass Labyrinth came out through 30 West Publishing House, which has also been a really good experience, but they definitely is not as many eyes as you get in something like a cohort process. And so, I did really lean on those second readers and people who I'm close with to make sure that it wasn't just me looking at everything and making sure it made sense to me, but really asking those questions and like, you know, again, the checkpoint idea, I think really solidified it. And I'm really grateful to my second reader who came up with that idea. It helped make sure that the poems didn't go in circles and lead you down pathways that you couldn't get out of.
Yeah, for
So,
sure. So I see chat has is having a conversation, and one that I also have in my notes. All of your book covers are they feel like they're specific. Am I correct in that like there is a reason for the book covers being the way they are?
there is, and I am very lucky because I have gotten to consult on all of my covers thus far, which is not typical.
Right.
It's a little more typical in small press than it is in big press, but most authors do not have the luxury of getting the kind of consultation I've been allowed to have. So for Glass Labyrinth, the artist for that was Carolyn Brandt. I will hold it up just for anyone who can see it.
Yeah, it is gorgeous. By the way, people can that are listening will be able to find links in the descriptions.
Yeah, so this was Carolyn Brandt, and she sent me concept sketches for a little while, like back and forth. And then we had a phone call where we really solidified what we wanted. But I was really attached to having the bathtub on the cover. And we talked about the bathtub as a lot of different things, but one of the things we settled on that I think really comes across in this cover is the bathtub as a scrying glass. So the idea that you are looking into it and you are seeing possible futures. And then every tiny detail on this has something of significance. The orchids show up in the poems, the dandelions, each of the insects that you see on the cover appears in at least one of the poems. And that level of detail, I absolutely adore an artist who can capture things like that. And then similarly, Stories for When the Wolves Arrive, Rachel Mulder did this cover.
Yeah.
And every image along the edge is something that appears in the book. But then the center image is hands in a vinegar jar. And that's directly from one of the Cinderella variants that I use in Stories from the Wolves Arrive. It's a Persian Cinderella story in which pretty much the first action that the heroine takes is that her teacher tells her to kill her mother so that the teacher can marry her father. And she kills her mother by pushing her into a jar of vinegar. And so the hands in the vinegar jar are the mother's hands.
Okay. And what about Out of Love in Spring with the claw and the bird and the plants and the flowers, and it's kind of dark but it's kind of beautiful.
Yeah, so this was done by Amy Dyerly Smith, and it's actually from a specific line in one of the poems, which I should be able to find.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's from a poem called Three Blows from a Hatchet,
Okay.
and the line is, and out of the cadaver of the blue jay we buried in secret, gr- grapevines grew. And so she has the beginning of flowers in this case coming out of a claw holding onto the bird. And so she's pulling from a couple of different images within that poem. But that what's so interesting about this one, since this one was a chapbook, the cover was actually done by a friend of mine. Um, Often that's the case with like smaller publications, is that you end up recruiting your own people to do certain things. But she was with me during the experience I had that I wrote that poem about, where we were restoring a farmhouse in Italy and we found a bird that had been attacked by one of the cats of the woman who owned the house. And the woman who owned the house was having a really hard time, and we did not want her to see this dying bird and have to decide what to do about it. We were 20 years old and we were like, we need to decide what to do about it. And the bird was clearly not going to make it. And so we had to kill and bury the bird before this woman could see this. And it was such a strange experience. And I definitely consider that poem a kind of grief poem. But it was really cool to have this art done by somebody who was with me while I was having that experience.
Or they all seem very fairy tale themed and feel to them. Especially Glass Labyrinth feels very ephemeral and does feel very dreamlike in it. So I love all of them, and I think they are all just really cool, unique covers. So kudos on all of those. And
Thank
again,
you.
like I said, so much so that the chat was talking about it during the live stream too. So it wasn't just me and my notes. I'm not the only one. So I thought that was kind of cool. Do you have any other projects coming out now that Glass Labyrinth is out and people can go and get Glass Labyrinth? Do you have any other stuff in the works, stuff that you can talk about?
I have things in the works, but nothing is quite at a point where I know when it will be out in the world.
Okay.
So I have written a fairy tale horror novel that is currently with an agent and on submission. The process of being on submission, for anyone who doesn't know, is a little bit of a dreadful process if you think about it so long. So essentially, what it is your agent has what you've written, and they are sending it places, and you are waiting. And the places they send it to might say yes or they might say no. And yeses usually take a long time. And eventually, at some point, you either get published or you don't. So I'm in that waiting mode
Okay.
with a horror fantasy novel called Epiphyte. It's based on fairy tales, but it's not based on any specific fairy tale. It was something I wrote really at a similar time to Stories from When the Wolves Arrive, but specifically similar. It was around 2020, so around when I was doing that big amount of fairy tale research during mandatory reading time.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a story about these two women in their early 20s who wake up in a fairy tale cottage together with no memories of their previous life. But in their previous life, they were very close childhood friends until the age of 12, at which point their mothers had a big fight and they never saw each other again. And one of them, her mother died during that period. And so when they wake up in this cottage, they have no memory of what's happened, but they are living in a fairy tale and they're living through fairy tale beats. They're getting invited to a ball. One of them gets a mysterious illness. And as they are trying to break out of the story, they inadvertently bring back all of their memories of their previous life and realize that every time they've tried to do something that is not within the rules of the story, it starts over.
Ooh, that's really cool. You'll definitely have to let us know when that is comes out. Not if, when. When
One day it's
publishers
gonna
out
happen.
there accept this book so we can get it. You've heard it here first. We want this. Do it, people.
Thank you for your vote of confidence.
Yes, yes. Glass Labyrinth launch party for people that are in the Seattle area or find themselves in the Seattle area. I can join you July 12th. The sitting room area is sold out from what I understand, but if you email them, you might be able to get in standing room. Am I correct on that?
That is correct.
So that's going to be July 12th at the Nook and Cranny Books in Seattle, Washington. So you can definitely check that out and maybe get in on there. So make sure to go nookandcrannybooks.com /after-hours, I think is the full website thing people can go to get that. And if they want to find you, you're at HaileySpencerWrites.com.
Yep.
And you're on Instagram, Out of Love in Spring, just like the book, right?
Yes, just like the book.
Just like the book, Out of Love in Spring. So guys, you can go and check Hailey Spencer out on the website or on Instagram. Hailey, thank you so much for being here. We're going to get to some of the Q&A of the chat here in just a bit. So if people are in any of the chats, they can go and drop their questions in for Hailey and get some more insight if you'd like. But I want to let everyone know that coming up, our next episode is going to be episode 100. In episode 100, we're going to return where we began. Our very first episode was with game designer and legend Mike Selinker, and he's going to be joining us for episode 100. If you like board games, I will guarantee you that you've played one of his games. We're going to talk about all of his new projects and the landscape of board game design as it is in 2025 and our current world atmosphere. So we're going to chat with him, check in with that, and see everything that is new with the one and only Mike Selinker. Of course, down the road, we're still going to get Trevor Bettis coming back with us. D&D legend Jeff Grubb is going to be joining us, and author Lenora Woods also going to be joining us. So make sure to follow, like, subscribe, and bookmark our new website, epicrealmsmedia.com. It has been completely revamped. Go and check it out, epicrealmsmedia.com. You can listen to all the episodes, view the old live streams, anything you want. It's all there, a one-stop shop for everything. So, for Hailey Spencer, I am Nick, and I want to thank you all for listening to Epic Realms.